And good morning to all of you. And thank you for putting this together. Thank you to Dawn and the Institute for Gulf Affairs. And let me say good afternoon to anybody who happens to be in the Royal Court who's tuned in to see what you guys have to say. I hope you're also listening. And perhaps you care more than anyone as to what Biden is going to do vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia. It's important to imagine what is going to change. Saudi sits, of course, in the middle of a very volatile region. It's engaged since 1979 in a power struggle with its neighbor to the north, Iran. It's engaged in a brutal and bloody war, directly engaged in Yemen to the south. Domestically, the Crown Prince is trying to institute some reforms from above. He's having some success with the young population who can enjoy, if they have the money, to attend a Mariah Carey or Pitbull concert. On the other hand, Saudi Arabia faces enormous human rights problems. Young activists and young and old activists, writers, and others languish in Saudi jails and face sham justice. And then there's, of course, Israel, the Palestinians, the Abraham Accords. There's a lot here to talk about. So let me introduce the panel. I'm joined by a distinguished group of experts on Saudi Arabia. First, Danielle Pletka, Senior Fellow, American Enterprise Institute, and author recently or a contributor to an anthology, 7 Pillars, What Really Causes Instability in the Middle East. Sari Bashi of Dawn, Democracy for the Arab World Now, the co-sponsor of this event, founded by Jamal Khashoggi in 2015. Thomas Lippman, a non-resident scholar, Middle East Institute, author of Inside the Mirage, America's Fragile Partnership with Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia on the Edge, the Uncertain Future of an American Ally. Let me begin with you, Danny. Let's imagine that, or pretend that you get a call from President Biden. And he says, you know, I got a lot on my plate. I got COVID, I got healthcare, I got a guy who won't leave the office. I'm plagued with a lot of issues, but I got to pay attention to Saudi Arabia. I got to pay attention to the Middle East. But help me understand, what is the current state of US-Saudi relations? What am I walking into here?
Okay, well, that would require a lot of imagination, quite a flight to imagine that Joe Biden would be calling me. But I'm happy to share my views, as indeed I have in a couple of op-eds. First of all, thank you to everybody for including me in this conversation. It's very nice to be here and to see all of you. We really have a difficult situation with Saudi Arabia. In some ways, you have a new Saudi Arabia, one that you talked about, Martin, and one that I think we're all aware of, the one for which we had very high hopes at the beginning of what we could call Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's reign, when he rose to power as Crown Prince, and that is sort of a Saudi Arabia that, to use the words that MBS used to me, a Saudi Arabia that is more like a normal country. Okay, that's something very much to be welcomed. You know, the Saudi Arabia that saw itself as a Sunni analog to the Islamic Republic of Iran, sort of the Sunnistan to Iran's Shiistan, was not a good Saudi Arabia. The old Saudi Arabia that supported Salafi jihadi movements, the old Saudi Arabia that supported Wahhabism, the old Saudi Arabia that afforded no religious freedom, no political freedom, no women's rights. We could go on and on and on here, and everybody knows the Saudi Arabia we're talking about. The promise that Mohammed bin Salman ushered in was that new Saudi Arabia. And in some ways, in some ways, as you said, Mariah Carey, Pitbull, but not just that. Women rising to positions of prominence, taking away taking away the ban on women's driving, taking away the ban on women leaving the country without a guardian's permission, and all of that. Those changes have taken place, and those changes are very good. Unfortunately, they've walked hand in hand with the things that perhaps we have paid, let's say, outsized attention to here in the United States: a feckless and unbelievably poorly conducted, even from Saudi Arabia's perspective, war in Yemen, the wholesale arrest of people who we could only really describe as competitors for either economic or political power in Saudi Arabia, the debacle at the Ritz, in which many Saudis well known to us were detained and money ultimately extorted from them, potentially even tortured, the arrest of women activists under the pretense that they were a national security threat. These are all echoes of the old Saudi Arabia, deeply unwelcome. And so we have these two images fighting with each other. And unfortunately, Mohammed bin Salman doesn't seem to be the man to resolve that problem. Rather, he seems to be the man who is exacerbating that problem, perhaps out of a lack of experience, perhaps out of a lack of vision, perhaps because that's the kind of guy he is. But then again, if we step back from the details of Saudi Arabia, we see that a lot of the exigencies that brought us into the relationship with Saudi Arabia remain, right? The geopolitics of the Middle East, perhaps less oil now that America has become much more energy independent, but perhaps more of a dependent for the future President Biden, because if he decides to ban fracking in the United States, that will obviously redound to Saudi Arabia's financial credit. But we still have, the geopolitical challenge of Iran that represents a very serious threat, not simply to our interests, but to the interests of our allies and our friends and our partners in the Middle East. We have a rising and very unpleasant power in slip of the tongue, Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Ankara, and that. Again, these sort of twin threats of the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood godfather there in Ankara, and the Hezbollah style Shia extremism in Iran do represent threats that, even if we wanted to turn our back on them, will continue to draw us in. And Saudi Arabia fits into that as a partner of the United States. So how do we deal with that? Two last little things for us to consider. One, Congress. Congress for decades, including when I spent a decade on Capitol Hill, didn't give a damn about what went on in Saudi Arabia. The much worse Saudi Arabia in terms of human rights, freedom, religious freedom, all those sorts of things, that got barely a glance from Congress. To the contrary, American companies being ripped off, you could go down the list. Saudi Arabia was an afterthought, and the relationship was very much managed at the White House Saudi embassy level. That's no longer the case. And even before Trump was president, you saw the passage of JASTA, a bill that essentially will serve the purpose of stripping Saudi Arabia's sovereign immunity in terrorism cases. That has yet to fully roll out, but we'll see what happens. But then last but not least, we have this sort of problem of Trump derangement. Not because we shouldn't all be deranged by Donald Trump in certain instances, but because not everything that Donald Trump did was bad. But there is an instinct inside Washington to have the pendulum swing from one side to another. Trump rejecting everything that Obama did, ripping up everything that he did, and now Biden coming in and being urged, certainly by many in his group, to do exactly the same thing for everything Trump did. Throw all the babies out with all the bathwater, and Saudi Arabia with it. I think that would be a mistake, but I think that's something for us all to talk about. Those really are, at this point, to my mind, the sort of the big picture issues that I think both constrain and bedevil our relationship.
That's a lot, and that's I'm trying to make sense of this, given all the things that I have on my plate, as Joe Biden would say. And so of all those things that Trump has done, what of them would you save? What of the Trump initiatives in Saudi Arabia are worth holding on to?
Well, first of all, I think that we need to recognize that when we turn our back on the Middle East, as indeed the Obama administration hoped to do, as I think Donald Trump hoped to do, when we turn our back on the Middle East, it is not that there is that there's a vacuum and the problems of the region go away. It is that the problems of the region are merely exacerbated by others who fill that space, whether it's the Russians or others. In addition, you see our friends and allies, the Israelis, the Saudis, and others, doing things that they believe are in their interests, but in fact are neither in their interests nor ours. And we can really put Yemen in that category. I think again that Saudi Arabia sort of and MBS in many ways felt the need to step into Yemen and to escalate the war in Yemen out of a false sense of how it was going to manage its own regional geostrategic challenges. That was a really bad idea. And I think that when we are more engaged, we are able to talk our partners, those with whom we have dialogue, off these very foolish ledges. I think disengaging with Saudi Arabia is a bad idea for that, among other reasons. And I think that's something that, let's set aside all the Donald Trump weird orb crap that all of us know, and that is part of the atmospherics of the Trump administration, and recognize that actually continuing to have a dialogue with these countries, as indeed Obama and now Joe Biden wish to have with Iran, is probably a good idea, while we still need to send the message that the human rights violations, the problematic pursuit of the war in Yemen are absolute negatives and need to be stopped.
Okay, great. So that takes us to you, Sari, where your focus is on human rights. How does human rights figure into all of this, given all these concerns that the United States faces, that the Biden administration faces in taking on Saudi Arabia and trying to reposition itself, but as Danny's suggesting, holding on to certain what you might call, well, to remain engaged, let's say. How do we do that and at the same time come down on what they consider a domestic affair that we have no business in messing with? How do we advance the ball on human rights in Saudi Arabia? Or conversely, is it for us to, why is it our responsibility to put pressure on them to improve their human rights record?
Sure. Thank you for the question, and thank you to the Gulf Institute and also to Dawn for hosting this. And Danielle, I appreciated your comments. Martin, I see it a bit differently. I think I'm not asking the U.S. to promote human rights in Saudi Arabia. What we're asking is for the United States to stop contributing to serious human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia and to stop preventing democracy in Saudi Arabia. So my reading of what Mohammed bin Salman has done, I agree with many parts of Danielle's analysis, but I would actually say that it's the human rights situation has gotten much, much worse under Mohammed bin Salman. Since his father was appointed in 2015, and more so since he became crown prince in 2017, there has been an unprecedented crackdown on human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia, to the point where every political activist, every human rights activist, almost every intellectual or religious figure who has been an independent thinker has either been jailed, intimidated into silence, exiled, or murdered. There are no independent civil society organizations left in Saudi Arabia. The same women's rights defenders who argued for the same things that Mohammed bin Salman has argued for are in jail, subject to horrific torture. And Danielle mentioned promoting women in the government. That's true, but it's it's this horrific gender washing. So the recently appointed Saudi ambassador to Norway, Amal Al-Mualimi, she's only the second female Saudi ambassador. And she has been vocal in talking about how her appointment empowers women. So she visited Lujain Al-Hathloul, a women's rights defender, in prison. At the time, she was a member of the Saudi Human Rights Commission. Lujain Al-Hathloul told her she was being tortured and asked her as a member of the Human Rights Commission to intervene, to investigate, to stop the torture. And she did nothing. And this is the person who is coming forward talking about the new Saudi Arabia. So I think that the new Saudi Arabia is worse than the old Saudi Arabia in terms of human rights violations. The war in Yemen, I mean, 12,000 civilians dead, most of whom were killed by the Saudi-led coalition, 85,000 Yemeni deaths from famine, fueled mostly by the war. I mean, this is a very bad situation, and the United States has been enabling it. Between 2009 and 2017, the US sold $76 billion worth of arms to Saudi Arabia. We have also been providing logistical and advisory support to the war. For a time, we were refueling the planes that were bombing civilians in Yemen. Even after the Khashoggi murder, the United States continued to offer valuable backing, diplomatic backing, and credibility to the Saudi regime. We also have 2,500 troops in Saudi Arabia. So we are actually helping the regime hold on to power. Saudi Arabia spends 10% of its budget on arms. We are arming them. We are giving them the power to crush dissent and to commit war crimes and other abuses in Yemen and other places. So the first thing we have to do is stop. That's the imperative. And I think that Congress has become more vocal about that in recent years, quite frankly, because the abuses have gotten worse. So we've seen a very interesting movement, a positive movement, where in some cases bipartisan support for accountability. Congress, a bipartisan cohort of Congress passed a law requiring the Trump administration to publish what it knows about the responsibility of Mohammed bin Salman for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. That has not been implemented, but that was done. There have been bipartisan resolutions, mostly Democratic, but with not inconsequential Republican support to end the war in Yemen, to end US funding for arms sales to Saudi Arabia, or at least limit them. There's something happening in Congress. There's a response to this horrific turn of events in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in terms of human rights abuses, and a recognition of the US role in that. Now, the question is, what will happen during the Biden administration? And Joe Biden has been very vocal in calling for an end to arms sales in Saudi Arabia. At least he said that a year ago. More recently, he's qualified it. He's talked about an end to war weapons to Saudi Arabia, implying that maybe it wouldn't be an end to everything. I think he'll have a lot of, I would be very pleasantly surprised if he actually followed through on that commitment. I think he's going to face a lot of pressure not to do that. And I think that the recent normalization agreements between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain with significant Saudi support are going to make it more difficult for the US to end or even restrict support for Saudi Arabia, military and diplomatic support. But I do think that there's an opportunity for the human rights community, for the advocacy community, for progressive policymakers, and for members of Congress to recognize that enabling Saudi Arabia's human rights abuses did not start with Donald Trump. It started with the Obama-Biden administration. And we have an opportunity to take stronger and more principled positions regarding those abuses. So it's very common to talk about conditionality. Let's restrict weapon sales. Let's condition weapon sales. Joe Biden himself a year ago said he would end weapon sales. There's an opportunity for people who care about human rights to try to hold him to that promise. And I know my time is short, but I'm happy to also say more about, maybe in the conversation, about how the normalization agreements between Gulf states and Israel could also create opportunities for civil society.
We'll come back to you. You make a very strong case for conditionality when it comes to weapon sales to Yemen. But on the domestic human rights front, what are the tools that we can apply, or should we be applying, that would really change the behavior of that regime?
So I want to clarify, I'm not calling for conditionality in terms of arms sales. I'm making the same claim that Joe Biden made a year ago. Stop the arms sales, period, full stop. We can reconsider later on if something changes, but stop the arms sales, full stop. That will do wonders for the human rights situation. The Saudi regime is a regime that is being
clear. I meant that you get out of Yemen, or we're not going to sell you any more arms. But
yeah, and I would phrase it differently. I would say we are not going to sell you more arms.
period.
And period. And if in the future you stop systematic human rights violations, you stop systematic abuses, let's talk. It's a new relationship. But the first thing to say, and again, this is not so radical. Joe Biden said the same thing a year ago. We will stop arms to Saudi Arabia. If we do that, the regime will be in a very difficult position because it is being propped up primarily by American weapons and 2,500 military American troops, but also by diplomatic support. And there are pro-democracy forces. There's a recently formed party of Saudi exiles. There are pro-democracy forces within Saudi Arabia that need an opening. They need for the regime to be a little bit less strong, a little bit less arrogant, frankly. And then something could open up for transformation. There may be other things the United States could do, but the most important thing is to stop preventing democracy in Saudi Arabia by enabling the regime to continue on with its abuses.
Okay, well, we'll come back to more of this. Thomas, I want to get you into this conversation. And could you give us some insights into this new administration? Sari has talked about what Biden has promised vis-a-vis selling weapons that go to killing people in Yemen. But what can you tell us about Biden, about Blinken, and the thinking inside this administration vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia?
Well, okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Ali. I haven't talked to you in a while. Look, I've been at this now for 45 years, and it's always easier in the Middle East to say what's not going to happen than what is going to happen. And that's true now with the transition to the Biden administration. There will not be a full disruption of U.S.-Saudi diplomatic, economic, or strategic relations. It's not in anybody's interest to stop cooperation on terrorism, for example. Those 2,500 troops, as Sari talked about, are there partly because we put anti-missile batteries in Saudi Arabia after the oil installations were attacked and the world's oil supply was cut off. So no one, the Biden national security and foreign policy team, as we all see how it's shaping up, there will not be the lavish sycophancy of Trump's first foreign trip as president, the infamous illuminated orb. And I don't think you'll see Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman making any more glad-handing tours of Silicon Valley anytime soon. But the people who are going to be making these decisions and executing these policies are career establishment, middle of the road, cautious foreign policy and military professionals who understand the region and understand the complexity of all the issues. General Austin, for example, who's apparently going to be the Secretary of Defense, was the commander of the U.S. Central Command. And Saudi Arabia and all the Gulf were in his area of operations. And you can go back and reread his cautious annual reports to Congress that he wrote. He understands the terrain perfectly well. Tony Blinken is a career foreign policy pro, is the son of an ambassador, staff director at Senate Foreign Relations for Biden, Deputy Secretary of State. He understands the region and the issues, and you're not going to see him run off with his hair on fire on the subject of human rights or any other in Saudi Arabia. And Jake Sullivan is another what you might call career professional on foreign policy. There are no amateurs and there are no crusaders on the Biden team. And I thought it might be useful. I'm going to read you a few comments from Blinken. And I'm reading now, the language I'm about to use is his, not mine. He said this on television. There's no dispute about it. He said to the Saudis, your new leader, your de facto leader, the crown prince, acts in impulsive and sometimes reckless ways. We're not telling you who should lead your country, but we are telling you he needs to be reined in some fashion. You choose how. This horrific war in Yemen that's doing extraordinary damage to tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians, that needs to end. This crazy division with Qatar, that needs to end. You need to resolve it. And you also need to demonstrate to the world that the things you're talking about in terms of liberalizing your country, you really mean. And that means letting people who've been simply trying to advance and advocate for human rights out of jail. And on the Crown Prince specifically, he said, I think Saudi Arabia needs a governor on his impulsiveness, on his recklessness, a governor of their choice, whether it's a regent or whether it's a council or something. And so my hope is that with experience, he's going to remain around. They learn something from experience, but the jury is out. That's not exactly the full embrace that Donald Trump gave. And I would also say that Jake Sullivan in public remarks, while acknowledging all the things that Gary has talked about, also said that I think we should deepen our support for Saudi Arabia in terms of the legitimate threats it faces that we've seen and face over the course of the past 2 years, whether it's ballistic missiles coming from Yemen, drones and missiles coming from the Iranians, or cyber attacks. And so that is going to be reassuring to the Saudis. Nobody is calling for severing the relationship. And this has been true now since I first went there in 1976, and it was true before that. There are always strains in the relationship, some of them more severe than we have now. You're going to remember the Arab oil embargo, when Henry Kissinger referred to them as savages. And so it's in everyone's interest for the cool heads to prevail. And I think that's the kind of temperamental approach that you're going to see from the Biden team.
Well, I guess the question I would have after that is if we read them back, those quotes, I mean, we try to hold their feet to the fire, call for changes as Blinken is doing. Will there really be any change? Do you expect to see any change from that? I mean, we read the riot act to Bashar al-Assad for years and nothing happened. He went forward, basically won his war. I mean, what of those things that Blinken is calling for will really be heeded, do you think?
Well, my experience has been that the Saudis are not amenable to tutelage from us on this subject. They inculcate their population from their first days of preschool with the idea that the system that exists in Saudi Arabia is ordained by God and is in compliance with the will of the Almighty. And they don't have school shootings and opioid epidemics. They don't see necessarily that we have the moral standing to lecture them on human rights or on how they treat their own people. They know perfectly well how we feel about it. The State Department has issued reports condemning Saudi Arabia on human rights every year since I can remember. It has never made any difference. Even Jimmy Carter, who made human rights the cornerstone of his foreign policy, went to Saudi Arabia and kissed their sandals because he wanted something from them, namely endorsement of the Sadat Peace Initiative. And so the Saudis know that we maintain our relationship with them in our own interest. And therefore they can't be bullied on this subject. You can talk, you can ostracize individuals, but the society is going to evolve at its own pace on its own terms.
That's discouraging to hear for people who want to see improvements in human rights, want to see an end to the war in Yemen, want to see all these proxy battles across the region that are destabilizing other countries. It's discouraging for all those people to hear what you're saying, because what you're saying is that nothing is really going to change here.
Well, I don't think that's true. I think you certainly can affect, we have direct influence on the war in Yemen. Right. And I think we've been seeing that going toward its conclusion, beginning with the sort of defection of the UAE from that phony coalition that the Saudis put together. And so there are things you can do. I mean, there are all kinds of straws in the wind about looking for ways to rectify the breach with Qatar, which is in nobody's interest. And the Qataris are not in a position to simply sever all relations with Iran. They're partners with the Iranians in the world's biggest offshore natural gas field. So I think, though, there are ways dealing with issues other than human rights in which we do have some direct and wieldable influence.
Khalid bin Salman told me that they could get their weapons from China if they liked for the war in Yemen, that they weren't dependent on our spare parts. I mean, I thought that was a ridiculous argument, given that, you know, they need to have parts that fit, but that was his attitude.
I lived in Egypt. I lived in Egypt for years during the period when Egypt was transitioning from complete dependence on Soviet arms and training to complete dependence on American and British arms and training. It's a very, very difficult transition. Very difficult. Nobody in the Saudi armed forces speaks Chinese. They can't, or is trained in China. They can't establish the kind of military relationship with China that they've built with the United States over 50 or 60 years.
So let's get Ali into this conversation. Good morning, Ali.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Dr. Pletka and Shai and Tom, and to you as well.
So what I wanted to direct I wanted to direct a question to you about how the Saudis see this, how they see. I remember meeting with MBS when just after Trump was inaugurated, and he was beyond excited, knowing what he could, knowing what was in the cards for him. So now he's facing a much different, at least rhetorically, and perhaps when it comes to Yemen, some real changes if Biden carries through on canceling arms sales to the Saudis. But how is he playing this? How is he seeing this? We haven't heard a lot from him on this.
Well, first I would say that Khalid bin Salman is not very good in terms of military, because he crashed an F-15 and broke his back in the process. So it's like almost a tradition. So he's not very good with these things. A few days after November 3rd, the American elections, both Jared Kushner and Mnuchin were calling MBS on, guess what, on his WhatsApp. And he did not take their call. Somebody told me this from the royal court. We don't know why the call happened, because he didn't take them. But was it about not giving Biden an endorsement, or accepting the results, or getting money for the legal challenge? MBS is now much more, I would say, seasoned than he was 3 years ago. He has, I think, he had some changes in his advisors, and I know one of them at least, who are with him now in NEOM. And I've said we have family interruption here. Go Baba. This is my successor. Go, Roy.
Well, we want to hear from her or him.
Him, he's 2.5. Sorry.
Yes, we are hearing from him.
Sorry. I told him not to let him in my office. So the speech by Turkey Faisal last week in Bahrain, which riled a lot of people in Washington, attacking Israel. This is part of the new approach that MBS is having, and it's not a new approach for the Saudis. They see this change in Washington, and every time they smell it, they have to kind of create this. Oh, we can go to China. We're direct, facing China. What about the Palestinian situation? It is their insurance policy. I remember this very well, and I'm going to read to you what I said on April 2002 to Margaret Warner on a PBS NewsHour when then Crown Prince Abdullah came and to meet Bush after September 11. These are my exact words. I think they are trying to build barriers ahead of and change the subject. The subject, in my opinion, should have been the Saudi role in September 11. Now the subject is suddenly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Middle East peace, not September 11. I think what we are seeing here is the same old policy. Biden comes, he says these things, which I don't think he's going to carry on. I remember Kerry saying harsher things. And when he became Secretary of State, nothing happened. These were really election rhetorics. Biden is not a left-wing politician. He's a Democrat, but he's more than a Republican than anything else. He's very conservative and right-leaning. And even Blinken in 2015 was in Riyadh and said, we will continue selling arms. And the Yemen war started under Obama, and not in spite of Obama, because remember the UN Security Council resolution 2216 happened with the support and the signature of Obama and his ambassador. This strategy of creating an incident ahead of a new administration is not new again, and it has happened before. To set the tone, to take the initiative, and I think the Americans get nervous and say, "Oh, we have to calm things down. We have to, we don't have to lose this relationship." And you will hear this. Oh, we shouldn't. We already see op-eds saying, "Oh, don't lose the relationship. It's so sensitive." And I've heard this many times in my 2 decades here in Washington. And the American system is open, so it gives the Saudis and other countries to influence the media and Congress and others. So I wouldn't see that policy will change. The American policy vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia or the region or the allies in the region, really, when it comes to human rights, it has not done very much. I've had meetings, hundreds of meetings with American officials. You get the lip service, but real change does not happen. And I wanted to just share with you, this news just happened hours ago, is that American citizen, Dr. Fatahi, was sentenced to 7 years in prison by the Saudi court just now, just a few hours ago. And why? Because he obtained American citizenship. That's his crime. So you get to figure, and this happened only a few days after Pompeo was there, and the State Department met with the Saudis. So that shows you really there is not a priority, and I don't think it could be a priority. Asking an American president to improve the human rights of other countries is really a tall order, especially now when Biden. He's not young, he's not revolutionary, and you have so much on his plate that he needs to fix domestically. And one thing is that human rights, I don't know why are we talking about, Tom, this is for you, but the mirage, I have seen mirages in my life, many of them, thousands of them. To ask an absolute monarchy to have human rights, it's like chasing mirage, and it doesn't work. And if the US could not and was not willing or unable, whatever it is, to improve human rights in Bahrain, tiny Bahrain, where they have 6,000 soldiers and a base, and they can do it with a phone call maybe, but they are not willing to do it. Because I think, to be honest, there is this sort of, what I call it, sort of this supremacy, call it American supremacy, Christian supremacy, like in the Pompeo world, for example. Whatever is the people in that region are not seen or viewed as important. The stability in the region for the American policy has been always about having governments or regimes who are allies. The people do not, they're second fiddle. And so I would say drumming up human rights, it's really a waste of time. There are other areas of improvement. What my view is, I think there should be a realistic policy, what I call expanded engagement, and that is about moving beyond the arms and security, and putting the sticker of stability on it. When you have a hungry population, this is unstable. When you have high unemployment, that's instability. The U.S. has a history that it abandoned. In 1931, I think many of you, maybe with the exception of Tom, know who Mr. Twitchell is. And this is an American individual, an engineer who was sent by another American from Chicago, Mr. Crane, a rich man, to Saudi Arabia to look for oil. And he found it and changed history in Saudi Arabia and the world. Is one man. He looked at, improved it, and he did it, in my neighborhood, just a few miles from where I grew up. And that kind of approach, what I call a Twitchell approach, is the idea is you have a country, and this applies to other countries in the region too, that doesn't have a postal service, that doesn't have, many of you who went there, that doesn't have street addresses, that doesn't have public transportation, that doesn't have sewage system. In Riyadh, for example, only 20% of Riyadh has a sewage network. This kind of approach is good for the Americans because this is where you make your money. Don't let the Chinese fill the gap. Don't let the Korean fill the gap. You can do it. You can actually be the American companies, instead of Raytheon building missiles, they can build roads and bridges. And finally, I would say that people talk about the Abraham Accord and the relationship with Israel. It's not a priority for the people, and people, most of them, because of what's happening with the Palestinians, are not going to be happy about it. What you are doing, you are just making it worse by forcing this. 20 million people, they have needs, they have aspiration. Their kids need to go to schools. Saudi Arabia needs thousands of new schools, millions of new homes, and the home ownership rate there is very, very low comparatively, even to Bahrain, for example. It's lower than Bahrain, with a tiny island. So I would say the bread and butter issues are more important. It's more beneficial for the American economy. And when Trump was elected, I wrote a letter, sent it to Trump through somebody I knew at the national security, and I said, Obama did not push for women driving in Saudi Arabia. You should push for it and get Ivanka involved, because if you allow women to drive in Saudi Arabia, more American cars will be sold, because Americans make better vans than anybody else. So you make money in the process. Make it this way. You link it to your own prosperity. Homes, hospitals, roads, communication, postal services, and all of these things, and even MLS listing for homes. This is something that the US can go and this will improve human rights in a way, because people will have more money and better health and so on. One last thing is, I think when you talk about the Abraham Accord, we forget about what I call the Muhammad Accord. Why does it have to be the American policy, this sort of the Pompeo world and his ilk, that we have to create problems between Saudi Arabia and its neighbors, between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, between Saudi Arabia and Syria? I think if the US was the peacemaker, it will be better for the US, and they don't have to have those bases and have these soldiers. They will be the welcome guest, the one who brings people together. There is, King Salman and Mohammed Salman, they could have saved a lot of money and soldiers and conflict if they just went to the Yemenis and said, how can we be friends, instead of we will bomb you and starve you to death. So this is, I think, a better way of doing business in that region, and the Saudis and other American allies will be much more comfortable with letting loose of their grip over human rights. When they see the Americans, things are better. The people in that country will say, oh, American company. I was born, this is my last thing. When I was born, my mother, I'm the biggest child of my mother, God bless her soul. And we didn't have hospitals at the time. So my father asked my aunt's husband, who worked for Aramco, to take my mother to Aramco hospital, and using her name, because women that time had many ideas, they didn't. So women, that was very common. So my mother used her sister's name to go to Aramco Hospital, and I was born there, sort of by faking it, basically. And I was born in an American hospital. That experience, if you see that in America, you know, my school was built by Americans, or, you know, but for money, not for free, okay, using the oil money. And my road was built by an American company. That is much more important than having the vision or the image of an American soldier on F-16 flying over your head. I think that is much more important. And I know it needs a revolution in the American policy making world. I think there should be sort of this moving away from sort of dominance and hegemony to actually being a good force for good. I think it will be much more beneficial for the United States, because the Chinese are going to fill that economic gap if you don't, and the people will be more pro-Chinese than they are closer to the American. Thank you.
Okay, I think you make some excellent points about building roads and bridges and hospitals, getting a postal system in place, and what effect that would have. On the other hand, I don't want to let you off the hook on the human rights question quite yet, and I'd like to hear from you, Sari, on this a little bit more. The question I get from a lot of people when I talk about Lujain al-Hathloul is, what does the Crown Prince gain by keeping this woman now before a terrorism court for crimes that are, you know, I mean, the list of charges that she's facing are ridiculous charges. One of them actually is talking to a producer for Frontline. It's insane kinds of stuff. What does he gain from this? And so if you could just answer that, Ali, and then I want to go to you, Sari, and hear your reaction to what Ali was saying about human rights. Ali?
Okay. Look, that's the nature of the beast. You know, when I was 14 years old, I was arrested with my family and mother and father and all, basically the family. And I was a kid, but I asked the guy, why am I here? Why I'm in prison? Why are you taking my mother? This is the first question I asked the interrogator. And he says, what did you do wrong? I said, this is a question for you, not for me. So in Saudi Arabia, the security mindset and the security sort of ideology is that it emanates from the ruling family's belief that they are the owner of this land and we are merely guests, and then we took this, and you should be happy that you live here, and we let you live here, and we are the one who gave everything to you.
But given all the attention that's focused on the women that are currently facing trial and others, Fatahi, who's just been sentenced, as you mentioned, why are these not bargaining chips where they can come down from their paranoia about security and use that to get something in return from the Biden administration?
I mean, they probably will do that. I think the fact that they sentenced Fatahi and they moved Lujain to terrorism court, and the same day that you know, MBS met Pompeo, that tells you, you know, where this current administration stands on these issues. And yesterday they destroyed the mosque of Sheikh Namr, where the protest movement started. So this is something that they would use, but it's important, again, with the subject. If you create a distraction, human rights are a product of a system. They are not the system. And I think Sari talked about this, that fact that the US has been standing in the way of change in many ways, because they've been supporting. When I was in that prison, when I was 14 years old, I remember this until today. The shackles and the handcuffs that you know, when they left me in the hallway, because they had no cells, not enough cells. So I look at it, and I was 14, and you know, I was learning English, and I saw "Made in California." See, that will never leave me. So the idea is the United States has been protecting the monarchy from its own people. I think that should be changed. It's okay, trust me. The sky will not fall if you step aside and let things happen. Sometimes you need organic. The United States did this, when they took against, against the British occupation or rule. And I think other people there have the right, and they deserve to be left alone, and to handle their own affairs with their government without interfering. And I think it will be better for the United States. Do not enforce change, but do not stop it. And human rights cannot exist within a monarchy. So you can talk about them, but to think that changing that or focusing on one part without talking about political change or political participation. And like I said, in Bahrain, the US would not even say we support election or a government that is elected in Bahrain, where the majority of the population clearly wanted it. So that's why I don't waste much time on human rights, because it's again, it's a mirage.
Well, let's get Sari's reaction to that. And the question comes back to, why doesn't MBS see advantages in using these trials as something that he can use as a bargaining chip, letting Lujain off, for instance, in return for something?
Yeah, I mean, look, there are theories that say that he wants to proceed in, for example, Lujain's trial when there's been no progress for 2 years, so that she can be convicted and then granted clemency. I pray to God that would happen if it means she would be released sooner rather than later. But I think that we have to remember that, Lujain al-Hathloul and Samar Badawi and some of the others are just a very tiny proportion of the people who are detained, intimidated, harassed, and forced into exile. And we don't hear about most of them, and we can't get public attention for most of them. So whatever he does with those few people who have a high public profile, I don't know. But I think the larger problem remains that the Saudi regime cannot tolerate any independent source of power. So Lujain al-Hathloul's case is classic, right? Bin Salman is the one who instituted, who undid the ban on women driving. And Lujain al-Hathloul was first arrested for driving her car into Saudi Arabia from the UAE. But the difference was that she didn't do it as part of the regime. She was seen, as many others were, as an alternative source of power, even intellectual leadership. So Salman al-Odda, who is another detainee, who is facing the death penalty. Some of the charges that he's been charged with include expressing cynicism about the government's achievements and calling for reconciliation with Qatar. That gets you the death sentence in Saudi Arabia, right? What was the problem? He was calling for reform, and he was very popular. He had millions of followers on Twitter and in other places, and he was calling for not even regime change, just reform. And that is seen as a threat. So I agree very much with Ali that we can't talk about human rights in the absence of democracy, right? Governments need to be elected by their people. And the problem with the crackdown, and maybe part of the reason it's so intense, is that it's successful. If we look at what's happening, political activists, dissidents, they are terrified. It has never been this bad. You used to know where the lines were, and you used to be able to say a little bit. And somebody like Salman al-Odda for years had this uneasy tension with the government, where they would let him speak and then he would push back, and then but you could anticipate. And now you can't, right? You might even go into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, and find yourself murdered, right? And I don't think Khashoggi was not dumb, but he didn't expect it, because it's gotten bad and it's very effective. People are being silenced. And that's why I feel so strongly that in the United States, the government should look very carefully at its role in propping up these dictators. Donald Trump said about the Saudi regime, they wouldn't last a week without us, and they know it. I think he's right. And so the question is, why are we still propping them up? Why are we preventing democracy? Why are we stopping the people in Saudi Arabia who are agents who want democracy? Why are we preventing them from getting it?
Danny, can I get you back into this conversation? We seem to have a kind of, well, I'm interested in your reaction to what Ali said about human rights, that he doesn't really see much happening on that front. Perhaps with investments in the infrastructure of the country and improved relationships, the future can change. But these current, many people, as Sari pointed out, that are in prison cells or facing absurd trials. Do you agree that not much can be done there?
No, I don't. Actually, you know, I think that the United States has not over the last, let's just talk about this century. Let's say since the end of the Cold War, the United States has not really found a great formula for pursuing human rights while at the same time managing our other interests. It's always been a binary sort in our government, and you really see that at the State Department. You know, when you look at the relative importance of the bureau that deals with this issue, democracy, rights, and labor, and the importance of the bureau that deals with the regional questions, NEA, the Near East affairs. You know, democracy, rights, and labor is the red-headed stepchild. Are we allowed to use that expression still? I think we are. The red-headed stepchild in that relationship. And you know, again, when we've had to balance interests and human rights, we've never done a very good job. Step away from Saudi Arabia for a second, because Saudi Arabia is in a particularly immune situation, let's say. We have less leverage over Saudi Arabia. That line about you won't last a week, I think is absolutely unsupportable by the facts. Let's talk about Egypt, okay? Hosni Mubarak, serial human rights abuser, okay? Arresting, murdering, extrajudicial killings, you know, human freedom. Yes, not the same gross abuse of women and of religious dissidents, perhaps, but still a record that he should have been and never was ashamed of, to be followed by two successors who are arguably worse. You know, one democratically elected, and then another who took power in a coup. You know, General Sisi. We provide these guys with $2 billion almost of assistance, hundreds of billions over the last half century, and yet we don't lean on them in ways that are effective. If we can't get General Sisi to cut the crap, if I may use the vernacular, our ability to get Mohammed bin Salman is also in question. But that's not about them. That's about us. And it's about our allies who don't back us up, particularly our friends in Europe. Set aside the Asians who have historically been much less concerned about this, even our friends in Japan and Korea. And that is the challenge. And where I will agree with Ali, and I disagree with some of what he said, where I will agree with Ali is that I suspect that these systemic problems in the United States, Democrat and Republican, are not going to be addressed in a Biden administration, which, as you said in your introduction, very rightly, has challenges like COVID and the economic fallout from COVID and everything else related to COVID, which take spaces 1 through 10 on the list of priorities for his administration, and you know, for Americans, rightly so. I believe and have always believed, and I'll end here because I'm answering and taking way too much time. I have always believed that the United States is capable of using leverage in a much more effective way, of chewing the human rights gum and walking the geostrategic wisdom walk. And I think that we could lean on Saudi Arabia for better compliance. I think we could explain what is necessary and what the cost to Saudi Arabia will be outside the public format of virtue signaling that the Biden-Harris campaign engaged in, but we don't. And that's a big problem for us. And I would suggest that it's a much bigger problem for us in places like the People's Republic of China than it is for us in Saudi Arabia. And we haven't figured it out there yet, where 1 million people are in concentration camps. So, you know, this is a challenge for us as a country, not a political challenge.
I want to go back to something that Ali said about building bridges and roads and hospitals. This is something that we don't do very successfully here at home, and 70 million Americans voted for somebody who only wants to build a wall. it seems. And there's no infrastructure investment in America. America firsters don't want that. I mean, Thomas, what chances, I mean, how do you react to the idea, which seems sound to us that spend time thinking about foreign policy and stabilizing regions? How much sense does it make that America could truly invest in Saudi infrastructure?
I don't see why we need to invest in Saudi infrastructure. They got plenty of money. And this has been going on now since the earliest days of American involvement in Saudi Arabia when I was a child, which should give you an idea how long ago that was. In Saudi Arabia, the electric current is 110 volts. It's not 220 the way it is in almost all of Europe. Why is that? It's because the Americans created the electrical grid in Saudi Arabia, but the Saudis paid for it. Right? We don't do foreign aid in Saudi Arabia except in some truly very focused specific things. They have their own money, and there was a time when they needed and wanted almost entirely American input into the development of their infrastructure, which is why Bechtel and General Electric, to say nothing of Aramco, were the major forces in developing the physical conditions of the modern country that you see today. They don't need Americans to do that anymore. Their nuclear power plants are probably going to be built by the Koreans. They can get all the electric power plants they need from France or Canada or whoever. And we can't just go in there and say, wait a minute, we're not gonna help you build your I don't know what sewer lines if you don't play ball in these other issues. I just think that's completely unrealistic.
Yeah, I didn't mean that we would have to foot the bill as much as we would have to clear the way. We would have to make it, we would have to encourage American companies to do more business with the Saudis. McKinsey would have to become active. I mean, all of this is sort of, I mean, they're building NEOM, but I don't know what use is that to average Saudi citizen. We do have some questions coming in on the chat, but go ahead.
NEOM is yet another ridiculous white elephant. And this also is something that has characterized Saudi Arabian economic development for almost as long as I can remember. They created these new economic cities. And my favorite was the one down in the Southwest, I think in Jazan, where the whole thing was going to be a joint venture with the Chinese and be based on a huge refinery that they were going to build in Jazan. And they actually started training young Saudis in Mandarin so they could work with the Chinese. And one day the Chinese said, wait a minute, this is on the other end of the country, 800 miles from the oil fields. What are you going to put a refinery there for? The Chinese took a walk, leaving the Saudis with this yet another white elephant, right? This has been going on for years. I'd rather see us discourage them from doing that than encouraging American companies to participate. NEOM, the whole premise of NEOM is that it's going to provide transit directly up into the Sinai Peninsula so you can truck things across North Africa, right, across through Egypt. Well, I don't know if you've noticed, but the Sinai Peninsula is not a good place to run trucking convoys these days on account of a huge terrorism problem. And they wouldn't need to do that anyway if they just come to terms with Israel, right? And so I think we've been wrestling with the planning issues and development issues for years. I just don't agree with the idea that somehow we have more leverage on this or through this channel than we do in other ways.
Ali, you want to respond to that?
Yes, I think it's not about leverage. The idea is the Saudis, you create pressure by saying, look, we will want to help you solve this issue because a happier population is better for the United States. It's better for Mohammed bin Salman. And sort of this basically almost intentional deprivation of the population from land, because, let me give you some information here that I'm talking about 30%, maybe more of the country's land has been expropriated by members of the ruling family. And so they are the one who are keeping it's cheaper for me to buy land here in DC suburb than to buy it in a small Saudi city because of the member of the ruling family taking away land, public land and private land, and then selling it in in inflated prices. And so solving this issue, building roads, like I said, Riyadh itself doesn't have widespread either public transportation, or if you send a letter, it doesn't get anywhere. There are no street addresses, and those who went to Riyadh, know this very well. Even in the capital, there is not such basic infrastructure needs. And that's why I think we should focus on those projects rather than selling them, because I think there is a lot of lobbying to shove Saudi arms or American arms into Saudi Arabia. There are arms here, American arms paid for by the Saudis, that are still in storage in the United States because the Saudis don't really need them. And to be honest, I think if you ask them, look, instead of selling you arms, we want to help you improve the country, they will like it. I don't think they'll be against it. And it's not going to be a security risk, and that will enable the population to be at least live comfortably without human rights. Because again, I use Danny used the Egypt model, I use Bahrain model, which is a smaller, and they can do it in a second. And Obama, or use Obama and Carter as indicator for who are supposedly human rights presidents. They were not even willing to say, hey, Al Khalifa, give your population a seat at the table, or let them out of prison. What we saw, Pompeo was talking about religious freedom a day before he went to Bahrain, which was ongoing religious crackdown, the largest. And it didn't faze him, because to people like him, religious freedom is his religious freedom, not the others. Those people in the Middle East, the savages, like Henry Kissinger said. So I think really the expanded engagement has to do with this. It's not human rights. Again, it's not for me. It's not you can talk about it, but it's not going to affect change. And sometimes, unfortunately, is used as a cover for, oh look, I've been told, oh look, we have this human rights report over here. And I usually dismiss it. They said, it's just a piece of paper. It's not policy. And you don't talk about it. Women's rights in Saudi Arabia did not improve for 60 years. Why? Because the Americans were not pushing for it. Kuwait, this is a very good example. Kuwait was liberated by the blood, and they got paid for it, obviously, of American soldiers. But Bush and Powell and others did not say, well, wait, you guys al-Sabah, don't allow women to vote. Can you please let them vote? They didn't even think about it, because that's how they perceive the region. These people do not deserve these things. And we are not going to waste our time asking our friends to let women vote. It took 20 years for a woman to vote after 1991. So it's, to me, it is, I think, pragmatically, I would say, engage, but on stuff that will help you reduce your security military relationship and increase your economic and developmental relationship, and stay away. Don't protect them, but make money. I'm not saying don't make money, and don't give aid. Let them pay for everything you build, but encourage that.
And I would like to nominate
one thing here.
General.
One thing, I'm sorry. Danny knows very well, we worked on the textbooks conference, and I've been talking about the Saudi textbooks, which are the fuel of terrorism in the Middle East, including September 11. And did anything happen there? Did the Americans push for it? No, it's still the same stuff. It's still the same anti-Jewish, anti-Christian, anti-Shia, anti-women, all that backward stuff. If the Americans are not willing to push for matters that affects them, they're not going to push for matters that affect the people, out there. I doubt it. And the woman thing is, whatever women like Muallim and others, this is what we call back home the china for the guest. When you have guests, you bring your best china to show it to them. You're not going to use those things. So I do not really think change will happen. I mean, they can try, but I don't think that this administration is going to be an administration that will change direction from previous trajectory of the American policy.
The one area that there seems to be some agreement on where there could be change, however, is back to Yemen. I mean, it's horrendous. I mean, I'm sick of the fact that for so many years now, it is on the brink of mass starvation, the world's worst human rights situation, and yet it just continues to roll on. But it's on that front that there seems to be agreement that by halting arms sales, there could be progress made there. Is that fair? Is everyone agreeing with that? No. Danny?
I agree that I think you can make a difference by saying, actually, by working on it. Just like now that Kushner is going to try to solve the Qatari-Saudi rift for 3 years, and I said this on Al Jazeera, and I said they are not serious about it. They are, benefiting. The Americans are from this rift by selling arms to each side and trying to keep people sort of divide and benefit. Right now, this is the same thing with Yemen. This exaggerated threat, oh, the Yemenis are going to, do this. It's better if the United States right now engages these countries and say, let's end the war. And they can do it through the UN Security Council. They can say this war should stop. Like the United States, like Samantha Power signed that 2216 resolution. The Americans can go to the UN Security Council and have a resolution there, and the Biden administration can do it if they are sincere. They can bring this up, which they stopped in the Human Rights Council, where you start looking for human rights crimes in Yemen. Then this how you stop it. Arms sale, they will do a Trudeau where they will, oh, this was signed by the previous administration and we have commitments and we will continue it. If you want to stop the starvation, allow American civil society to go to Yemen. Members of Congress, Sanders and others should go to Sana'a and fly there, and then they will see a different reality. I think right now we are seeing an exaggeration of threat or fabrication of threats, and we cannot trust these people because they have chance or they don't submit to us. I think this idea must change, and the region has changed. And there is a famous Egyptian play in my generation. It says the kids have grown. I think the region is a different region. It's not a region where if the Americans say, oh, we are a force of good, people be like, oh yeah, you are the force of good. People are way smarter. They are more aware of what the American and others are doing in the region, and they see through that. So it's really important to come to this reality that a stable region means a region where people are involved in the process, where people are respected, their human rights are respected, and there are no bombs falling over them from American drones or Saudi or proxies, whoever these proxies are over their head. So it is, America could be that peacemaker, and I hope it can achieve it, I think, very quickly.
Okay, I saw you shaking your head, Danny, when I put out the idea that perhaps there was agreement that if we halted arms sales to Yemen, there would be progress.
There's this eternal willingness on the part of
Or halt arms sales, I'm sorry, halt arms sales to Saudi, not Yemen.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. There's this eternal willingness on the part of people to think magically about what the United States is capable of, and an eternal willingness to deny agency to the parties involved in conflicts. It doesn't have to be Saudi Arabia and Yemen. It can be other things. The reality is that Saudi Arabia perceives that it has interests in Yemen, and it is not going to ignore those interests if we stop selling them arms. That I think the Obama administration understood that, although its reaction to it was in my mind misguided. The issue here is that first of all, we face a situation in Yemen where everybody is right. The Saudis have committed atrocities. The Saudis are pursuing a conflict that is not simply targeting the Houthis, but also targeting Yemeni civilians in ways that are unconscionable. They face a genuine and potent enemy in the Houthis, who are being armed and trained by Iran and by the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran. They are bad guys. We have interests in Yemen. We have Al-Qaeda and ISIS that are operating in Yemen and that are threatening not simply operationally the United States and our allies from there, but also looking across the Bab al-Mandab. We have bases there, and we have problems in Africa. All of these things are real. And there is no magical silver bullet that suggests that if we just do this, just send Bernie and a couple of his bros and everything will be solved. That's just not a realistic way to look at this. We need to address all of those challenges in a multidimensional fashion that is different from the frankly incompetent way that this has been addressed thus far, with occasional threats, withholding of support of one kind or another, anger, working through the UN, working through our allies in Europe, working through mediators. None of that has worked. We need to address all of this, and we need to do it in a serious way. The problem is that for the United States at this point, the stakes aren't high enough for us to be willing to commit that kind of energy. We all agree on this call that we should. The problem is we are not the United States government, right? We are just the kibitzers on the outside who hope that someone will listen to us when we write our columns and think in our think tanks. But we need to be a little bit realistic about this. There's no magic there. I'm sorry to say it.
I think you propose playing a sort of a 6-dimensional chess game where you take all these things into consideration at once, and it makes it so complicated that I fear nothing gets accomplished. I'm not saying that
That's where we are now, right? Nothing has been accomplished.
I wanted to get Thomas on this. I mean, I think you were before talking about halting arms sales, and I mean, I'm not suggesting it's a magic bullet, but I'm not suggesting that a 6-dimensional chess game is going to take place where we successfully win.
Look, I was in some awful place in the Middle East. I don't remember where it was, where the people were clearly being abused by the government, and they found these tear gas canisters that had been used to disperse the crowd. And the people couldn't wait to show me what it said on the tear gas canisters: made in USA, right? I mean, they knew that perfectly well. And I agree with Danny when she said that this is not about them, it's about us in some ways. We can do the right thing by getting the guilt of Yemen off our hands, right? We won't be doing it. We won't be parties to it. That we should not have the illusion that Yemen will then become a peaceful, stable, constructive, prosperous country. The separatist movement and the Houthis are going to fight it out. We could go back to the old days when South Yemen is actually a separate country. We don't know what's going to happen in Yemen. We have no control over it. But what we do have control is over what we do. And that's why it is indeed, as Danny says, a multidimensional problem. And you know how bad it is. There was a point when the situation was so bad in Darfur, the people from Sudan were fleeing to Yemen. And I got to figure that, that's the definition of desperation, right? And it exists all around that region, particularly in the Horn of Africa. But we can cleanse our own hands of this as long as we don't necessarily think that the Saudis are then going to stand down and let Yemen unravel in ways inimical to them. The issues will be there for them.
Sari, get you on this?
I just think we should, sorry.
Go ahead.
I think we shouldn't underestimate the impact of the U.S. halting arms sales to Saudi Arabia. I think the Saudis are emboldened for many reasons, but a larger reason is American military support, including the troops. And so I think if we were to end arms sales, it would be a very big wake-up call to the Saudis. What would they do in Yemen? I don't know, but there's a good chance they would find ways to end the war. And there's other things we could do too that are proactive. I think there's a lot of potential in working multilaterally. If the U.S. were really to be supportive, for example, of UN brokered peace efforts, if the U.S. were to work more closely and more strategically with allies in Europe and also in the region to try to be a force for good, but starting from the principle of do no harm, because it is unconscionable that we conceive of our interests as somehow if we supply billions of dollars of weapons to an actor who is using it to bomb children in Yemen, that's going to advance our regional interests. I mean, that theory is so attenuated. It's not clear at all that it's true, that this kind of very long-standing American belief that it's in US interest to have stable dictators who are allied with us and that somehow makes us safe. I think there are a lot of people who would question that. But I think that as Tom said, the first thing to do is to stop funding it. And I will say there are many people in the US, partially in the State Department, but also in the Defense Department, who are raising serious questions about possible American culpability for war crimes because of the assistance we're given. And this is criminal liability. So there are many reasons we should get out of there.
The argument that has been made, as you know, is that we supplied them with targeting, and we supplied them, with coordinates for the jets they were using, the jets we sold them, or the French sold them, or the British sold them, so that they wouldn't launch bombs erratically and kill innocent civilians. So our involvement, this was the Obama administration's rationale, I believe, was that we should continue to supply them so that they could more accurately target Houthis rather than bombing weddings or funerals.
Right, so 5 years later and 12,000 civilians dead, a majority of whom have been killed by the Saudi-led coalition, it's not working. We're not helping prevent civilian deaths, we're fueling civilian deaths. And those billions of dollars worth of weapons and what they mean to the region, it's a signal that Saudi Arabia carries US backing. And that is a very powerful signal. We have the capability to withdraw that, both functionally to stop giving, maybe eventually in several years, decades, they could find somebody else to supply them weapons, maybe. But let's be realistic about what we can know. We know that our weapons are killing civilians in Yemen. We can stop that and work multilaterally and see what could develop in Yemen. And yes, at least then our hands would not be dirty.
Okay, so we're now at, we've just got 7 more minutes and there's so much to cover still. We really haven't covered all that I had hoped, but I just want to get some quick wrap-up comments if there's anything left over. And let's start where we began with you, Danny, and we'll go to Sari and then Tom and then Ali. Just quickly, because we don't have a lot of time.
Sari said something that I agree with wholeheartedly, that has been a failing of American foreign policy, not just in the Middle East, but globally. And that is a belief, sometimes more artfully expressed, perhaps, that stability that derives from a dictator is somehow of a similar quality to the stability that derives from a democratically elected leader. And even if you don't choose to posit the sort of equivalence between the two, the United States has always been very comfortable with a variety of dictators, particularly in the Middle East, but also in Africa and Asia and elsewhere. And this is a long-term problem for us. Honestly, if you want to ask what my priorities are, I'm really more excited about the 500,000 people who have been murdered by the Russians and the Iranians and Hezbollah in Syria. Yemen is not the top of my list. Yemen is not the number one thing. Now, does that mean that we should tolerate, just because you killed 500,000 people, does that make you worse than someone who killed 12,000, potentially with support, with the use of US weapons? No, they're both bad. But if you want the United States to do something, I would suggest that you look to one of the world's most heinous crises and what we did about that. And then ask yourselves whether we're going to do something about the slightly lesser crisis in Yemen.
Thank you. Sari, any final comments? Your audio is off.
Unmute.
There you, no, now you're still on mute. Click
I
again.
think you're
There-
muting me.
No, I'm not. You're
Oh, okay.
good. You're good to go.
Okay, sorry. I wanted to end with an optimistic note because I think that the last few years have seen a bit of a shakeup in terms of advocacy for human rights in Washington, including among members of Congress. I think there's been a lot of attention among mostly Democrats, but not just, to making human rights a more central part of foreign policy. I think new initiatives like the Quincy Institute, which is, bipartisan conservatives and liberals coming in and suggesting that maybe we should have, common ground around human rights. That's all very interesting. And I also think, the one thing the Biden administration says it will do is to have a more diverse administration with people of color, with women. And I think that because so much of US policy toward the Middle East is predicated on those brown people can't manage democracy, and they're not ready for democracy, and it's white people saying that, I think that the more you diversify the Biden administration, the more that there is hope for a different view of people in the Middle East as people who do deserve democracy and can get it if we stop preventing it. So long term, I think there's a lot of reasons to think things will get better.
Thank you. Thomas.
Even if look, you can never be too cynical about the Middle East. Even if we assume, which I don't, but even if we assume that the people of Saudi Arabia, by and large, want to get rid of the Al Saud regime, even if we assume that, which I don't, what they haven't done is identified for themselves an alternative model of governance that they would embrace collectively. They know what they don't want. They don't want the kind of pseudo-parliamentary government that they see next door in Kuwait, which has essentially paralyzed the country, right, and taken it backwards. They don't want the kind of model they see in the United States, where people are roaming the streets with guns, right? They don't want to see the kind of governance model that the Israelis have, right? What good are the elections in Israel? Elections are not the magic elixir, and I think we ought to keep that in mind. If you think like an American, if you think about Saudi Arabia like an American, if you assume that they want what we want, you'll get it wrong.
Thank you. Ali, you want to bring us home?
Look, I think the issue here is information. People don't talk about the 140,000 Yemeni children who were killed because of this war, through starvation and bombing. This is the largest number of children killed in the world in any conflict in the past 20 years. Maybe, after Iraq, the starvation of the Iraqi children, which, Albright said, she didn't think a big problem of it. The idea here is sometimes it's not up to the United States to dictate what's going on there. Let these people figure it out. I disagree with Tom, the fact that the people don't know what they want. They do. I organized an event in 2003 in London. There was the first meeting of various Saudi activists, even government, pro-government, who talked about what should be in the country. Our people are not as savages as maybe many in Washington think they are. And we are not as crazy, and yeah, we have our crazies, but these are the crazy that the governments did. You have your own crazies, there is one in the White House, but and his ilk. So, but the idea is, change should not be imposed or stopped by the United States or by the UK because they're worried about their interests. It should be let these people will grow up, will learn what's good for them. I think change and political change is important, and it should have been part of the United States policy to encourage greater participation of the population. Gradual, controlled is better for the US, but the US is not going to do it. You have barriers in the United States. Failure, you call it, Danny, but it's really almost ideological heritage that the US forgot its own history when it overthrew a monarchy, an absolute monarchy, to now be the security guarantor of the largest Saudi Arabia is the largest absolute monarchy in the world. And so you are protecting them, like Philip Mudd told me, from domestic and external powers. So I said, even against human rights activists, he said, yes, against even human rights activists. And he's right. This is why Robert Jordan, the former ambassador, refused to meet with me in 2001. And he met with those people who are spewing anti-Semitic and anti-Christian and supporting terrorism in Riyadh. So you have a history that you cannot deny that. And I don't think it will change during the Obama administration. I hope it does. I really do, because I think it's better for the Americans to have sort of this positive role to play in the region. And they can do it if they want. It just has to be a decision, a willingness on the president. And, this is Mr. Blinken called me. My phone is, it's published online. You can call me. I'll be happy to come and talk to you in details. Saudi Arabia is not a dead case yet. We can still save it.
Okay, well, I hope Tony is listening. Anyway, it's my job to cut this off, and I'm thankful to all of you for joining. For Danny Pletka, Sari, Bashi, Thomas Lippman, AlAhmed, thank you, and thank you to Dawn and to the Institute for Gulf Affairs for hosting this. I hope the rest of your morning goes well, and thank you.
Thank you so much.